It's time now for World Watchers International with Mae Brussell, who for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and it's broadcast number 518, November the 8th, 1981. There was a cartoon in the Houston Post last week. I haven't seen it in the papers out here. Maybe you have. It's a large square piece of paper, and in the center is just a small bullet. And to the left are some quite large letters saying, "A device used in changing the course of history in less than 30 seconds." This is November the 8th, and soon after you get these tapes on the East Coast or overseas, it will be the anniversary of the assassination of John Kennedy, November 22nd, 1963. A little bullet does change the course of history, not only for that event, but many, many other events that have followed since that date or happened before. And I know too well by the studies I've done how many little tiny bullets have actually changed the course of history. And I like the cartoon. Of course, the purpose of my 17 years research, and it will be beginning the 18 years in November, in 2 more weeks, has been to see who was firing those little bullets that did, in fact, change the course of history for every single nation on this planet Earth. That bullet didn't just go into John Kennedy or blow his head off. It affected our lives in every way that you can imagine, and there is an event in the newspapers that I take that can't be related to or directly linked or indirectly made through 1 to 2 parties for events that happened in Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. I don't believe that it will take 18 more years to finger who was doing the shooting from either end, whether the back of John Kennedy, from other buildings behind him, or who blew his head off at the fence. I think if we had 1,000 pieces of the puzzle, maybe there's 800, 900 in now, and there isn't a day going by that more information doesn't come in to fill in those pieces. It won't be too long now until you really know who was firing in Dallas and who killed President John Kennedy. There was an article this morning from the Night News Service, a large article, a half-page story in the San Jose Mercury, "The Missing History in TV Networks News Tapes." It's by David Ben Sully, and it's a long story about how the major networks are losing many stories that should have been recorded for all times. And they bring out a point. They say the results are uneven for the way the news is covered on TV. They said the Kennedy and Lee Harvey Oswald assassination footage is spellbinding, but the Bay of Pigs coverage is spotty, and the absence of the Abraham Zapruder film and a discussion of the Warren report is regrettable, and so is the glaring omission of the Nixon-Kennedy debates, anything pertaining to Kennedy's rise to power, because as soon as he was shot in the head, Richard Nixon was being prepared prior to the assassination to become the President of the United States. He was groomed for that for a long time, and they make note of the fact that the coverage or discussion of the Warren report is regrettable, because now it is only 17 years later, and the House Select Committee on Assassinations has said that there was a gunman at the fence at the grassy knoll, that there was a conspiracy to kill John Kennedy and Reverend Martin Luther King, and Congress has never gone into the Robert Kennedy assassination. So that part of our history is missing, and what is missing over NBC, ABC, CBS, the major networks, or even public broadcasting, is the real truth, the things that I can tell you on KLRB or other radio stations that is the truth, is very badly missing from the people in this country who are entitled to know the truths, and a lot of the information is locked up in the archives for 75 years, and now 50 more years the material from the House Select Committee. If there were no secrets, there would be nothing really to lock up. I hope this evening, or those of you who get this tape later, have had the chance or watched 60 Minutes. This evening's broadcast, November the 8th, out here in California, 60 Minutes, and also Becky's. Frank Terpil and George Korkola were on 60 Minutes. I've been talking about those guys for 2 years on this program, since December 1979. This last week there was a half-hour program about them on television, but this was 60 Minutes and a lot of coverage. And it was a very interesting interview because these men are very sure of themselves. They know what they're saying, and they had a lot of innuendos in the interview, much more than I expected. I thought it would be a complete cover-up of their activity with Gaddafi, but very little of the program is about Gaddafi. The program began with an introduction that Frank Terpil and George Korkola are not exactly household names. Back in July the 3rd in 1981, I was saying on this broadcast, get used to these names. They're not known to you yet, but they will become familiar, and I gave a list of people working with them and around them, and you will become familiar with those names in the next several years to come. These exposés will unravel more and more, and I don't believe that it will be covered up. Watergate was covered up, the Kennedy assassination was covered up. All of the things they have done in the past will not be told, but a lot of it will come out. They cannot cover up everything these men have done. They were arrested in New York in 1979 for selling 10 million rounds of ammunition to the New York Police Department. 10 million rounds is a nice sum of ammunition to sell to two people who they haven't said what purposes they were selling it for, but they said we never sell to the Soviet bloc. There's nothing that they deal with that has to do with communism. They are violently anti-communist. They're anti-Semitic too, but it didn't come out in this evening's program. They're living in Beirut, Lebanon, but they travel all over the Middle East. They were asked about supplying Idi Amin with torture equipment in Uganda. They sold him $3.2 million in torture equipment, $11 million in interrogation equipment. And they were very glib, and you just got to admire their honesty. They said, Terpil said, well, this exists. I didn't develop the torture equipment. It's sold. All of this is made by United States suppliers. It's made in the United States. We sell material for rapid interrogation. And he said, what's the difference whether you use a hose in Mexico or whether you use electric equipment or tripods or whatever, strobe lights and chemicals in Uganda? What's the difference? It's made in the United States, and if you're going to make a buck, we're going to make a buck. And they said, what about Dow Chemical, and what about DuPont? And we built the torture racks, the medieval racks for the Shah of Iran, and they're used down at Colonial Dignidad in Chile. The CIA assists, makes them, manufactures, puts people on these racks and stretches them apart and quarters them up and does every kind of torturing device that you can think of. And these men know that the United States multinational corporations make the chemicals, make the poisons, do the experimenting, torturing. So they said there are just two people out of maybe they said 15 or 20 doing this, and why not make a few million dollars? The major corporations do it, and they said this exists. We didn't develop it. They didn't design it. It's part of the American system and economy, and if we want to finger somebody, then really we have to finger ourselves and not them. They discussed the story that Jack Anderson had written about where Frank Terpil was at dinner with Idi Amin, and there were 10 or 12 people there, and the head of the prime minister, former prime minister, was on the platter, and Amin took a gun out that Terpil had given him and shot some more bullets in his head, and the head was severed and on the platter, and he said, well, he was a defense minister who was plotting a coup. And Morley Safer said, well, did you eat dinner? He said, sure, Amin ate dinner. We all ate dinner. Didn't think anything about it, so there's a head on the table. And Morley Safer said, what about the morality of this? And then Frank Terpil said, what is the morality? And he made a remark that I'll go into at great length, if not this evening, on another broadcast. He says, Israel supplies and sold weapons to Amin. Moshe Dayan is a good friend of Idi Amin. He was a friend, and I have believed for a long, long time that Israel is a Nazi country dealing with Nazis, and these men are hard-ass Nazis. And he made it quite clear that Dayan is a friend of Amin's, and he threw it out in a sense that I didn't expect the interview to be very honest. Get your hypocrisy off my back. Say it like it is. So what? The Israelis sell the weapons. We sell them to South Africa, Argentina, Taiwan. I talk about it all the time. And Dayan's a friend of Amin. They asked, would you sell these? Where do you sell these? Do you have any scruples? He says, never behind the bloc, meaning never the communist bloc. Now, they import Soviet weapons. They buy Soviet weapons. They're training people in Pakistan. They didn't mention that this evening. And then they can leave weapons in Afghanistan and say they're Soviet weapons. A Soviet tank was used when Sadat was murdered. They buy Soviet weapons, but then they can leave them and say the Soviet Union did it. They mentioned a friend of theirs who was killed last week by the IRA, and they said, don't you feel badly? Ken Howard was killed last week, and I was wondering if maybe this friend was one of those who was sacrificed. There were several broadcasts this week of people that had worked for them, and Edwin Wilson, who had hired them, said that he had threatened to kill each of them, and that's why they were talking now about their work they had done for Wilson. And maybe this Ken Howard over in Great Britain was one of those that was blown up because he wasn't going along with what Wilson wanted, and he was sacrificed, or they were giving Korkola and Terpil a lesson by having a friend of theirs blown up. They didn't seem grieved about it. They seemed to understand why he was blown up. And as I say, they mentioned explosives are sold. He says, how does Dow Chemical do it? How does DuPont do it? And you remember at the time Jimmy Carter was president, he had Peter Braun putting $34 million into Mexico to put paraquat into marijuana to sell to this country. So the hippies, the anti-war protesters, there are no hippies, but the people using the grass may find 4, 5, 6 years from now that they have cancer, because they had these chemicals put into a substance that they knew that this particular generation was doing. And they said, ask about DuPont and Dow Chemical. Korkola said, we are not immoral. And this was the interesting part that they got into when asked, are you immoral? He said, we are not immoral. When I saw what our government does and what they contacted us to do before our arrest in New York, and even after we were arrested, in spite of the arrest, our government asked us to make bullets with deadly poisons for United States weapons. Now, George Korkola is the fellow that I've mentioned on these programs over and over. I had one broadcast, Who's Afraid of George Korkola? Jeff Gerth doesn't write about him for the New York Times, or Philip Taubman, or Jack Anderson. None of the journalists, Seymour Hersh, will mention Korkola's name because he heads Amstec Corporation in New Jersey. He does security for the Secret Service, the FBI, for Scotland Yard. He arms the so-called terrorists to make it look like the left. And he works with Mitchell Wirbel and the Silencers, and he works for Edwin Wilson, the paymaster of the Bay of Pigs, and Theodore Shackley, who were behind the John Kennedy assassination, the Wilson and Shackley in Miami with the JM Wave group, going back to the Kennedy assassination, not long before. These people were involved, and I think their security from arrest, their security of getting off charges, is that they know who they're related to and who they work for. And they were very assured of themselves, and it was an interesting program because they didn't consider themselves any worse criminals, I guess, than Lyndon Johnson or Jimmy Carter with Jonestown, or Richard Nixon and the payoffs of the various murders of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. And that's how they got to be president, how Jerry Ford got to be president. John and Robert Kennedy were murdered. This is how Andrew Young gets to be the mayor of Atlanta, Georgia. He's on the balcony with Martin Luther King and keeps his mouth shut. They don't think anything of it. Their friend's head is blown off. Jesse Jackson was on that balcony, and as was Andrew Young. They keep their mouth shut like Terpil and Korkola. That's the game. They know the game. They know the rules, and they laugh. They laugh through the whole program. They don't consider themselves immoral. And in all truth, they're no different. They're simply an instrument of the major corporations to kill anybody who's in the way of getting tremendous profits. They said the government asked us, even after they were arrested in New York in December of 1979, to make bullets with deadly poisons to put into weapons. Now, these guys know about the Bay of Pigs. They were part of the team to keep trying to kill Fidel Castro. They were part of the murder of Allende down in Chile. I don't know, they worked with Conein, who was involved with the Diem murder, the Letelier murder. in Washington, D.C., the Omega-7 bombings and murders in New York City and New Jersey, the Alpha 66 murders and bombings in Miami, the anti-Castro Cubans. They're involved with a world narcotics traffic that hasn't yet come up, with links to the murder of Judge Wood in Texas. They have expertise in blowing up aeroplanes. They work with Warbell and the silencers. And they're very matter of fact that what we know about what our government did before. This is what he said, and what they asked us to do, we were very surprised that they arrested us in New York. He said even after we were arrested, they wanted us to do government work. They gave us contracts designed for assassinations. This is what they said. We never thought we would go to trial in New York after all we did for them in the past. It reminded me of James McCord threatening to tell everything if he was charged at Watergate crimes, of E. Howard Hunt threatening his blackmail if he was pinned too tightly against the wall, of William Colby threatening Senator Howard Baker at the time of Watergate if they blamed the CIA for too much. All of these people have worked together, Richard Helms and William Colby and George Bush as director of the CIA and Vernon Walters. And he said they gave us contracts for assassinations. Now, all of this was about assassinations, what they did before, very little about Gaddafi. And that was the amazing part of the interview this evening. He said, we never thought we'd go to trial in the past after all we did for them. We never thought we'd go to trial in New York. And, of course, the question is, what did you do before your arrest, which 60 Minutes never asked? Or what did you do for them? Or where were these assassination weapons going? They said the FBI came to them after they'd been arrested and said they wouldn't be alive if they testified on their past jobs, but if they left the country, nobody would stop them. And they left, and they're multimillionaires. They just left the country, and they're living overseas, and they're not coming to this country. What does government want from you, they were asked. And one of them, I forget which one, answered, probably I was privy to information on how Washington is done. Is that how LBJ was paid off when Kennedy was murdered? Was that how Otto Winnecker, the German, was sent to write the Warren Report? Is this how payoffs were made to Richard Nixon after Robert Kennedy was murdered? They know how Washington is done. They talked about payoffs. They talked about payoffs in the State Department with high officers, how they pay CIA agents to pass on information to them that is vital to other countries. Now, they're not spies for Moscow. These men are spies for the Fourth Reich. These are Nazis. These are hardcore killers. They are working for Nazi organizations that were set up after World War II, and they make no bones. And other articles and things coming out about who they are, what they are, and there'll be more on that later. They use classified information to pass on, and they are not going to be charged with treason because the CIA was set up by Reinhard Gehlen, of Hitler's chief of intelligence. Did the CIA know you were shipping explosives to Libya, they asked. They said, yes, they knew we were dealing with Gaddafi. This has been known for 7 years. They were recruiting active duty special forces of the Green Beret. They were working with active duty CIA people all along. That, in essence, is the interview of those men on 60 Minutes. And the thing that was so interesting about them was, I guess, their raw honesty in giving you a little tip of the iceberg and just letting it out. We're doing what everybody else is doing, and we may as well make our money from it, and we're doing more, but we'll come home and they probably would get off the charges in New York. And they say we'll face the federal charges for shipping explosives to Libya because it'll never go to court on the basis of national security. So just drop the gun weapons sale in New York City and they would be home free. Nothing like this would ever go to court. So that was the interview in 60 Minutes of Frank Terpil and Gary Korkola. I call him Korkola, and he's referred to as George in this program. He called him Gary. But there they are over in Beirut, Lebanon. There's a lot of Nazi training camps there. They're violently anti-communist, and Beirut, Lebanon is where Mark David Chapman went for 6 months. This was before he was in New York and killed John Lennon. And he went from Beirut back to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, where agents of these people, Theodore Shackley and Edwin Wilson and Terpil were being brought over from Southeast Asia, Laotians, and so forth. So I think that there are very strong links, and on the anniversary of Lenin's death, I'll bring in the route of Mark David Chapman again and the links to this assassination team and the people who wanted Lenin dead and how these men worked for those people and have worked for them all along. I did 2 articles for Midnight Globe, that small paper that comes out in the newsstands and liquor stores, drugstores around the country. Last week, 2 weeks ago, I did an article, When Was Oswald's Body Switched? And it's a question of whether or not that actually was Lee Harvey Oswald in the grave, because the grave was cracked open and they couldn't have gotten through that steel reinforcement, concrete reinforcement, the way they did, and the way the tombstone evidently was easy to dig under. The earth probably had broken the original casing. I don't know at what time or when, but I do have reason to believe that that body was switched. And I have more reason to believe after my favorite subject was in the newspaper just this week, the last 2 days, reports suggest that wasn't Eva Braun at Hitler's bunker. Many of you who listen to this broadcast in the college area, particularly in young people, are too young to remember the absolute confirmation that Adolf Hitler died and his mistress Eva Braun died, and detailed descriptions of Martin Bormann being with them just to the last minute, and then he escapes and the great lovers die together. Now there are records that she possibly may have escaped. These were in the Associated Press today. The British Medical Association news review on the discrepancies of Eva Braun, and that in fact wasn't her in that bunker. Now, if they could lie so carefully about Eva Braun with all this identification, and if she in fact walked out of that chancellery, I assure you that Adolf Hitler walked out of there too. They walked together. They didn't just get married a couple of days before so that he could die and she would leave. And there have been many, many stories. There's as many accounts of their having left Germany as there are of the way they died. And I've talked about that many times on these broadcasts over the past years. So I update those programs, and many of you will see it in the news during this week. If you didn't see it today, the report suggests that wasn't Eva at Hitler's bunker at all. There are a lot of substitutions for people who were supposed to have died, and the person that is in that grave is not, in fact, there. And this story is just the interesting thing, because how do you separate Adolf from Eva, and who was buried with Adolf, and how would that happen? I don't believe it happened that way. They planned their strategy for 2 years, and I sincerely believe that they both left, and they left together. If 50% of the team left, and you can be assured that the other one just didn't die, and she left without him. There's no reason to believe that, and there's a lot of evidence that he left with her. Another article I did for the Globe just this last week, it's a quotation of another researcher and myself, that Mr. Renzo, who wrote the book on the Gemstone Files. It's an article called Howard Hughes Funded the JFK Assassination and the Murder of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And this article mentions Thane Cesar. He was the guard at Lockheed, and the allegations that I have made and other researchers have made for a long time that he was the person who shot Robert Kennedy and killed him, and that Sirhan is the front guy for this. This is just a short article. I did a couple of short articles about one on Howard Hughes and one on the Oswald grave. Apropos of this particular article, or these 2 articles, I got a telephone from John Meier up in Canada. Johnny is going to be taken down to Los Angeles. He's been charged on, he says, a trumped-up murder charge of a man named Alfred Netter, who died in Beverly Hills at the Hilton Hotel in 1974. Johnny Meier worked for the Howard Hughes organization. He's the person who said in January of 1981 that there was no Howard Hughes, that the Howard Hughes is a CIA front. It's an agency that had control of the Hughes organization. Johnny said Howard Hughes was not buried in Texas. He had a press conference. This was in January of this year, almost a year ago, that the Hughes organization is just a CIA activity using the Hughes Corporation as its cover. Now, Johnny was charged with this murder, and he's going to be taken down to Los Angeles. The trial is supposed to begin soon. and several people had testified against him. Interestingly enough, his partner was called Mr. Ehrenfried Liebich, Ehrenfried Liebich, and there often are these long German names, and this is one of the people that got tied in with Johnny Meier, and this netter died at the Hilton Hotel, and he's being charged with this particular murder. And the FBI or the United States Police, Johnny's had a heart attack, and they said, we'll take you down in an ambulance, and we'll start the murder trial of this Netter case and charge you with the murder. We're going to drag you down to Beverly Hills. And Meier was offered, he told me, and I believe it was on the national radio or television this week, he was offered immunity, or they dropped the charges of the Netter murder if he would turn over all of his papers on Howard Hughes and the Hughes organization. I asked Johnny, call me this week on the telephone, because there was a two-part deal they made with him. The first part was turn over everything you know about the Howard Hughes organization and we'll drop the charges. And the second thing is, do you know Mae Brussell? How well do you know Mae Brussell? When did you meet her? He said, she has nothing to do with what I know. He says, what is your relationship with Mae Brussell? And he was with his lawyer, and he's going to send me a copy of the agents that were with him this week. And he says he was under tremendous pressure. He knows he was set up. And they might have thought, or they know that I've known John Meier, but I've gotten none of my research. Well, I'll take that back. I did get a whole packet of papers, about 150 papers that were in the hotel when Vance Cooper died in Mexico. That was the double for Howard Hughes that was buried in Howard Hughes' grave. And most of the things down at the hotel were put into shredders, and some of it was sent up to the Canadian police and copied. And Johnny Meier sent me about 150 or 200 pages of very important documents directly copied from papers in the hotel at that time. It was in 1976. But outside of giving me that packet, the article I wrote about the Hughes organization being a cover for the assassination is nothing that I got from Johnny Meier at any time. I haven't done research with him. He told them we hadn't, that he knew me personally. I met him through the telephone conversations through Terry Moore in Los Angeles, who I was working with on some stories, and she's been very close to Johnny Meier. So I don't know what trouble the feds will do, or whether they'll try to plant information on me like they did on him, or trumped up charges, or just what they have in mind. But they were giving a lot of pressure to him about Mae Brussell, and he was a little bit scared about it. So he called me and warned me that they were trying to make some connections between him and me. A lot of work I know I've done through hard research. I said that wasn't used in the grave long before I ever dreamt that I would be talking to Johnny Meier, and I published that for Playgirl. He confirmed these things. I said to him on the telephone, answer me I'm going to ask you 4 questions, and either say yes, yes, or no, no to these questions. I'm going to ask you 4 questions. Did you know or work with Edwin Wilson? Yes. Did you know Frank Terpil? Yes. Did you know Thomas Klein? Yes. Did you know Theodore Shackley? Yes. That's all I had to know. He told me he knew all 4 of them, and these people are very important to the whole era of American history. That's why I said the way the bullet flies in 30 seconds changes American history. I did talk about Johnny. This was in January 1981 on tape 477. If you have those tapes, on what he said about the CIA and how they controlled Howard Hughes. They're going to drag him down. He won't turn over any papers he has. He thinks it's none of their business. They're going to drag him down to that trial in Beverly Hills, and it'll be interesting to see what they produce against him or what they try to do to him. Speaking of the Sirhan case that was done by Thane Cesar, I mentioned briefly in that article, there is a magazine called South Bay that comes out of the West Coast here in the San Francisco area, October 1981. And there's an article about Sirhan and quotations of Dr. Edward Simpson Calas, who lives here on the peninsula, and the mind control of Sirhan and how he was controlled by the federal agents, and how Mr. Van de Kamp, the district attorney in L.A., keeps wanting to keep Sirhan in prison and lock him up and a lot of people believe that he did not fire those fatal bullets into Robert Kennedy at all. Interesting thing in this article, it mentions that Mr. Van de Kamp has an interest in the RFK assassination. It began immediately afterwards when he was headquartered in the Washington, D.C. offices of Director of the U.S. Attorney General's Executive Office. I didn't know that the District Attorney of Los Angeles, Mr. Van de Kamp, John Van de Kamp, L.A. District Attorney now, was working in Washington, D.C. in the U.S. Attorney's Office at the time Robert Kennedy was assassinated, and then tore out to California to be sure that Sirhan stays in jail. And, of course, they've kept a lid on working with Thane Cesar and who really killed Robert Kennedy. And that Thane Cesar worked for Lockheed, again going back to the Howard Hughes organization. He was a guard at Lockheed and is active with Nazis in California at the present time. We'll take a 1-minute break and then get back to some other news stories of the week. Even though I give you a lot of bad news on this program, there are a lot of good things happening, or interesting things happening if you follow the news regularly. Last March 29th, the night before Ronald Reagan was shot, I did a broadcast on KLRB here on the infighting in the White House. The sheet that accompanies this broadcast that goes out with the cassettes had the title, "The Top Dogs Are Fighting Musical Chairs Who Will Kill Their Team Members Off." And I explained how Alexander Haig is angry. He wanted control of domestic and foreign emergency powers. And the battle team, I've referred to them, and I mentioned on that broadcast, the battle team, all direct links to the assassination of John Kennedy. Now, all of these people that I mentioned on March 29th, the night before Ronald Reagan was shot, I mentioned had links back to the Kennedy assassination. Almost all the figures that I mentioned on this program in the past 10 years, this is the 11th year, or any time that I read in the news, almost every single one that's making the news with these scandals and various plots goes back to Dallas, that very important day, 17 years ago, it'll be 18 years ago, in 3 more weeks. And I said, this battle team who are fighting go back to the Kennedy assassination, and I listed 5 people: Alexander Haig, Walter Stessel, Richard Pipes, Richard Allen, and William Casey. Now, just today in this morning's paper, in the San Jose Mercury and the San Francisco Chronicle, there were 2 large articles. I'm sure back east you got them too. One is said, "Behind the Bitter Feuds in the White House." Now, I was calling those feuds in March, and this is November. Backbiting at the White House jeopardizes the United States' economic and their foreign policies. That's the San Francisco Chronicle. Another article, "The boss puts his foot down. He asks for peace. The collegial spirit of Reagan White House has come apart on 2 fundamental aspects, the making of economic and foreign policy." And it's got a picture of Richard Allen and Alexander Haig and Treasury Secretary Reagan and Mr. Stockman, and they're all fighting each other. They're similar, and I've compared it to Little Black Sambo, where the tigers take the clothing of Sambo and they strut around, each one thinking he's the grandest tiger in the jungle. Now, I don't know how these people can handle their relationships. All of them worked with Theodore Shackley, Edwin Wilson, Frank Terpil, George Korkola. They all have so much on each other, and they can't afford to fire one of them or there'll be trouble, and they can't afford to keep them. These are the conspirators. They go back to Dallas. They're in the White House now, but they're getting unglued. They really are fighting each other, and I have many, many articles on Reagan and his team. Can he shake up his team? Can the president stop the Haig-Allen feuding? The White House plays down the feud. Haig paranoia follows him. He's looking for enemies in the room. Haig and Allen feud boils in the open. There are many articles, and you've seen them all week, how they're going to resolve it, if they're going to resolve it. A story saying if they fire Richard Allen, Haig won't do the president any good anyway. If they fire Haig, he knows too much. They can't afford to fire him. They're in a no-win position now. They've got Korkola over there talking. They've got Frank Terpil. They've got Edwin Wilson, Thomas Kleins, Theodore Shackley, and plus these other 5. I can name 30 or 40 people, John Connolly and every person on that intelligence board that Reagan appointed, Edward Bennett Williams, Mr. Perot, They all know what happened in the past, and they're sitting there with a hot potato, and they're just passing it around, and someday it simply has to come out. It will come out, but all of these people may come down. I believe the Reagan gate, the real Reagan gate, is the Wilson Terpil Korkola story. I think in the next half a year, three-quarters of a year, it could even bring Ronald Reagan out of office. I can't tell you why now, but you'll see it maybe in a few weeks to come, 3 or 4 weeks to come. I don't see how he'll be able to stay in office as this scandal unfolds. In the meantime, he has plans, or the government has plans for some of us, and I better be getting my winter coat. I got an article from the Houston Post. Refugee detention center has been approved. Now, we decided that the immigration naturalization would stop having refugees in. They're going to put a limit on refugees. We can't certainly bring from a war in the Middle East people up to Wyoming, up on the Canadian border. But in Glasgow, Montana, the federal government has repurchased what it had before. It's an Air Force base of 51,000 acres that they're setting up on an abandoned Air Force bomber base, a detention center. They've put $100 million into the detention center. It was deactivated in 1968, and it's just been turned over now in 1979. It was turned to the county, and now it's going to be turned into a detention center. It's been approved that 51,000 acres in northern Montana will become a detention center. There's already $100 million into it. So if the anti-war movement goes good, and if there are protesters in this country or race riots, I venture to say they'll end up in Glasgow, Montana, because that detention center is ready, and it's very isolated. That's a lot of acres. And if you look at the map of the United States, it's just a little bit over to the right is North Dakota, Minot, North Dakota, and that's that base, that Air Force base where John Carr, the buddy of David Berkowitz, was stationed, where he died, and that's where that young woman lived who went out to Stanford Chapel. She was murdered. They lived near Grand Fork, close to Minot, North Dakota, and it's not very far. Minot comes into the David Berkowitz, son of Sam case, and out to the Stanford, California Stanford campus. This is our Siberia, I guess. This is a place that you can keep your eye on. $100 million on a lot of acreage, and you can do a lot of damage with 51,000 acres and $100 million in a deserted base like that. So forewarned, there's a nice detention center waiting for some of us, I suppose. Now, there are some subjects that I want to bring up on this broadcast. I don't know if I'll have time this evening. One is the big controversy of the Medfly spraying out here in California, and the motives for that, which I believe are to try to get Governor Braun out of office because of the Medfly scandal. There have been a lot of radio broadcasts in the Bay Area and discussions of this because the planes brought in were federal government planes run by the Central Intelligence Agency, used the head of one of the corporations as Mr. Dooley, 17 years with the CIA. He worked with Lieutenant Conein in Southeast Asia. He worked, again, with Edwin Wilson and Theodore Shackley. And the assassination teams I'm talking about tonight, they had the Evergreen airline that took over Intermountain Operation, Intermountain. CIA airplanes, they insisted on these fertile, they were supposed to be sterile flies. They weren't sterile, they were fertile. There were supposed to be several 100,000 flown in from Peru. There were 200 to 300 million. And it's become a very expensive operation in this state, bankrupting the state, that makes Jerry Brown look bad to ruin his political aspirations. It may boomerang now because congressional committees are going into the Medfly story. There's an article in the paper today, the $100 million Medfly fiasco is the latest evidence of our monumental ignorance. We call the Bay of Pigs the fiasco, but that was a good motivation for killing John Kennedy and using the anti-Castro Cubans to murder a president of the United States. $100 million that the state couldn't afford to lose. The planes came out of NASA and the Air Force bases that belonged to NASA. They had sprayed the Indian reservation, this gang, with their CIA airplanes in Arizona, 1978, 1979. The CIA did the spraying then, and there are agents of the CIA involved with this. They selected the sprays. In Arizona, people were getting sick and being rushed to Scottsdale Hospital, and they weren't told that there was 2,4-D and 20 other chemicals. They were spraying the Indians in the reservation, the Pima Reservation of Indians, and they were sick in droves. This Air America was a partner later with Anna Chenault, the Chenault Association in 1946. Air America was formed in 1950 by Mr. Dooley. He was the man behind Air America, and then he was the man behind the airlines that are doing the spraying at the present time. As I say, 17 years with the Central Intelligence Agency. It's quite a scandal of the Evergreen Airlines and Intermountain Airlines, written up in several books. Victor Marchetti's Cult of Intelligence talks about Mr. Dooley. There are other books, the Rockefeller hearings on CIA operations overseas or at home. The Southern Air Transport, SAT, was originally founded in 1949. It was 50% owned by the CIA. It was the plane that Dag Hammarskjöld was on when he went down on a peace mission in the Congo. Intermountain Aviation had its headquarters in Marana, Arizona. It still has, with Mr. Dooley. And it was founded, interestingly enough, after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. The CIA decided that they had to have their own airline, that they couldn't count on the United States forces to protect them. The CIA is a private army, so they made their own airline as a means of getting around to do what they want, such as the war in Laos or in Southeast Asia, without telling Congress, and they were involved in other coups in Portugal and all around the world. It's their own, CIA's own airline, and it was this airline that was brought in, Mr. Dooley, who masterminded the forming of Air America. He used to fly for Pan Am, went to Harvard, and then left, was in the CIA until 1971, and set up his own franchise of airplanes and worked again in the Bay of Pigs with the Double Check Group in Miami. The same people that were involved in the spraying, the Medfly in California, the $100 million, the risks on people's lives, that same group, again, are linked to Wilson and Terpil, the people who were involved with the Kennedy assassination, the Double Check, and Dooley had even set up the Civil Air Patrol, and David Ferry was running that when Lee Harvey Oswald was his student before Oswald went in the Marines. Dooley has a history going way back in the United States with the government, with the CIA, 17 years with the CIA, ruining Governor Braun's career, making fun of him, blaming the Medfly errors on him, and it's become a political football that involves, again, the Central Intelligence Agency chemically spraying people using CIA planes, determining where the flies would come from, bankrupting the state, while Governor Braun is the governor, spending all this money and using it as a political operation to catch 2 or 3 flies that can't really move too far out of their geographic area. They don't travel all over wildly, as one would believe. It's a political football that I may do more on the origins of the airlines, the CIA, and the role they've played in the last few years. I don't have time this evening, but I will get back to it because there's many people who listen to this broadcast up in the Bay Area and in California where the Medfly was sprayed, and they can begin spraying again any time they want. But I'm going to leave that for the moment, and I want to introduce a name to you that was in the news in May, that just this last May, and tell you about him because it's an important name, and I'll be updating later the information. I can't give you all the reasons I'm talking about him now, but I want to give you some. His name is Otto VonBolschwing, B-O-L-S-C-H-W-I-N-G. The Los Angeles Times had an article on VonBolschwing, May 28, 1981, California man accused of Nazi war crimes. Now, the federal government has 223 additional cases besides VonBolschwing to go into, but he's described by Robert Jackson in the Los Angeles Times as one of the highest-ranking Nazi war criminals that has ever been located in the United States. And one of the reasons VonBolschwing is important is because of his relation to Nikolai Malaksa of the Romanian Iron Guard, who was brought into Richard Nixon's office in Whittier. He was a very important member of the Gestapo, and he headed the division over Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann was killed and sentenced in Israel for war crimes about 16 years ago, but his superior, VonBolschwing, has been living very fruitfully in California all of this time and wasn't brought in with Adolf Eichmann for the same trial. In 1940, he was in Nazi intelligence. He was an officer in Romania. He was a top advisor to Adolf Eichmann on how to exterminate. He worked for the United States government, the OSS, during the war period of World War II, while he also was Himmler's SS agent and Adolf Eichmann. He had a dual role, and the story of VonBolschwing is one that you must become more familiar with during the years, is that while our fellows were dying at the Battle of the Bulge and in Southeast Asia and in Europe, while the war was going on, Allen Dulles and the OSS chief and Mr. Donovan were working with the top Nazis at the same time that the war was going on and making provisions for them to come to this country, to be safe, to be very wealthy, to be heads of businesses while the war was still going and no peace treaty had even been signed. In 1959, he was naturalized as an American citizen. The reason he might be deported now, although he says he's old and sick, is that he concealed his past membership as an advisor to the Gestapo. Now, I think that would be a little hard to do if he was Adolf Eichmann's aide all this time, 1934 to 1941 in the Gestapo. Eichmann headed the Gestapo Bureau of Jewish Affairs, and VonBolschwing gave information and advice to Himmler's SS and to Eichmann on what they should do. He was the chief of Himmler's intelligence for Romania. He was part of the Iron Guard. He assisted the Iron Guard, and this was a select clique of violent, fascist, anti-Semitic people. According to the Los Angeles Times description, they murdered, they persecuted both Jews and non-ethnic Romanians from at least 1940 to 41. He was right hand in glove with Nikolai Malaksa. In a book, The Order of the Death's Head, by Heinz Thane, this is the story of Hitler's SS. On page 334, it tells about Adolf Eichmann and his attitudes towards the SS. It said, interestingly enough, he didn't know whether to join the SS or the Masonic Lodge. But under the tutelage of a particular person, Mr. Mildenstein, he learned to be anti-Semitic. And then Eichmann was given the Zionist organization desk, and he learned Hebrew. He learned Zionist words. He learned to go to Palestine. He knew all about the country. He studied Theodor Herzl's books. He knew Hebrew grammar. And you think of these people like Adolf Eichmann as distasting or disliking anything Jewish, but he was an expert. And he had a memorandum, a book called the Zionist World Organization, and people thought that he actually came from Palestine. He was such an expert on Zionist World Organization and Palestine. And when he really got into the question of Zionists in Germany and the Palestinian question, he called on his friend Otto VonBolschwing, who was a member of the German party, the SD, and former with Adolf Hitler's group. And he was in contact with Palestinians and Germans in the intelligence activities in Palestine. This was in the 40s, and VonBolschwing was working with Adolf Eichmann on the Jewish desk and Zionism at that time. Now, he worked in the Romanian Iron Guard, and in that book, Wanted Search for Nazis in America, and I've mentioned it on this program before, Howard Bloom's book, it tells about Nikolai Malaksa and how he worked with the head of the American Office of Strategic Service in Romania, a man named Grady McClawson. So that VonBolschwing worked with the OSS, and Nikolai Malaksa worked with the OSS. Malaksa got $2,460,000 in American money when he came to the United States. He worked for the OSS, and then he came to the United States and was paid $2,460,000 for a plant of his in Romania that was taken by the Russians. And he went to Chase Manhattan, and they gave him this money at Chase National Bank. He had millions of dollars put away for during the war that they usually kept for war criminals. But he got that money from Chase Manhattan. He got another $2,460,000. Then Maloxa went to Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and his law firm of Sullivan Cromwell, and former Air Force Secretary Thomas Finletter, and Undersecretary of State Adolf Burl. And on their behalf, he got into this country to pass through. He wanted to become a citizen. And Maloxa went to a junior senator from California, Richard Nixon, who introduced a private bill in 1951 to let him to remain permanently in this country. The bill was defeated, but he went to Whittier, California, where he used Nixon's office as the headquarters for a dummy front of Western Tube, then went down to Argentina to Martin Bormann and Otto Scrizetti, and that's where they set up headquarters for the Odessa, the World Nazi Organization, and he came into this country through the Iron Guard to Richard Nixon's office, and his friend, Mr. VonBolschwing, came into this country to California also, and has been living here ever since. Maloxa died a few years ago. There's another book, The Minister of Death. I have not received. The book is in New York. A subscriber to these tapes has obtained 3 or 4 copies. He's sending me one, and it has discussions of Adolf Eichmann and Otto VonBolschwing and how they worked in Palestine and helped set up Israel. And the book is on its way here. I haven't read it, but pages were copied for me, and this friend wrote, I've sent you copies relating to VonBolschwing. In this book is fascinating, and it shows the Nazis were well behind the Jewish state. And I've believed for many, many years the Nazis were behind what is known as Israel today. Interestingly enough, as I say on the program this evening, 60 Minutes, when they talked about morality, Terpil said, well, Israel ships us, our weapons, and Amin is a person who has the picture of Adolf Hitler all around him and praises Adolf Hitler, and they supplied weapons to Sadat and Nasser, who were formed and put into power by the Nazis, and money from Nazi parties, and trained with Mein Kampf and reading Mein Kampf. There's a book about Sadat that was sent to me that mentions how Sadat made all of his military people read Mein Kampf, and that he was told in 1954 that Adolf Hitler was alive. What letter do you want to send to him? You see lots of literature about the fact that Hitler's alive. So Wilson and Terpil and Korkola are arming Idi Amin and Gaddafi and the PLO and the most violent people, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and the Israelis seem to be going along with this and working with these people. It looks like they're angry at them, but not really angry, not angry enough to expose them, and simply playing the game. So this story of Adolf Eichmann, written in the book The Minister of Death, talks about his relationship to Otto VonBolschwing and their work with the Haganah in Palestine and also with the Gestapo simultaneously. And when I get a hold of this book, I'll do more about this man for you, because his relationship to California politics is very interesting. I can't go into all of it now. Just if you have books on Nazi Germany, keep this name in mind and look them up. I have some sources now, and get that straight in your heads, because the name will become important. As I say, I can't go into it for certain reasons at this time, but I'll be bringing it up later. In 1972, in that article, my first published article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? Many of you are familiar with this and have the article, and some of you don't. In the section how Richard Nixon came to power, I described his relationship to Allen Dulles, and at the end of World War II, or while the war was going on, Allen Dulles was in Switzerland for the purpose of rounding up and importing to the United States what he called German specialists. This is what I wrote in 72, 9 years ago, that by 1972 he was rounding them up, and by 1942. And in 1942, Allen Dulles was working with Otto VonBolschwing, who was Eichmann's advisor, and the OSS. They began to put him in the OSS the exact year that I said that Allen Dulles was rounding these people up to bring them to the United States. 2 years before the war ended, or its fate was even decided, I wrote 9 years ago, the United States was making arrangements for these Nazis, scientists, arms experts to come to our democracy, for which the boys were fighting and dying at that moment. From 1945 until 1952, the U.S. military brought over 642 alien specialists and their families from Nazi Germany. And then I wrote, enter Richard Milhous Nixon, who was serving the Navy Bureau of Aeronautics, and he was stationed in New England with the Combat Air Transport Command right out of the South Pacific. And his role, April, May, June 1945, was to help bring these Nazis into this country. And then Richard Nixon, who was in New York serving the Navy and Navy intelligence, gets a telephone call to come to California to run against Jerry Voorhees. Now, when I wrote this article 9 years ago, I didn't know that Congressman Jerry Voorhees from California had gone before the House of Representatives to fight about holding I.G. Farben, the Nazi cartel, together. What Voorhees was telling Congress was that we will have World War III if we don't break up this Nazi cartel. And, of course, that new book that's out on Bormann, Nazi in Exile, tells about the 750 corporations that Martin Bormann set up to begin the Fourth Reich as soon as this other war was over. There was a warning by Voorhees and others that we would be just where we are today. And Richard Nixon was placed by the aerospace, by the people working with the Nazis, and his office was later used by the Iron Guard and VonBolschwing's companion from Romania. And this whole can of worms of the Red Scare, the House Un-American Activities, the killing of labor leaders, blacklisting people, emanates from the end of World War II when these people were brought here, and Richard Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover and a team of people from the State Department, the intelligence community, were getting ready and building up their muscles for that next war that we read about every single day in the newspapers from Weinberger and Haig and the President of the United States, the threats and talk of war, a limited war, full war, and so forth. This article I wrote 9 years ago had the story of Alger Hiss trying to break up the cartels and the German rearming, illegal rearming in the 30s, and I hit the nail on the head on how Nixon came to power. And after I wrote that article, then other books came out and other people's names are surfacing, these deportation papers that were in the Los Angeles Times in May on VonBolschwing, and the Iron Guard is just one more link to Nixon's office and the Nazism in this country. There's a woman, Vanessa Redgrave, who's had many feelings about the PLO, not the PLO funded by Wilson, Terpil, and Korkola, but the real needs of the Palestinians. And she had a statement this last September in the newspaper that she's interested in showing the influence of Nazism on Israel's Zionist philosophy. From Beirut, British actress Vanessa Redgrave says she wants to make a documentary film with the Palestinian Liberation Group to show the influence of Nazism on Israel's Zionist policy. If VonBolschwing and the top Gestapo people with Eichmann made the Zionist policy, then that's where the Nazism came in, and it stayed there. And, of course, Begin came out from Poland into Siberia, into the Soviet camps, and is a violent anti-communist, anti-Soviet person, and he is dealing with the far right-wing, the most extreme right-wing fascists that there are on planet Earth. So Redgrave, who's been a long supporter of the PLO, is asking people to understand that the Zionist movement is a Nazi movement, and that Nazis influence Zionism. And I hate to tell you this, but I agree with her 100%, and I think a lot of information coming in will verify that. There's a lot to think about and talk about. We can't barely scratch the surface because these are complex problems. But watch the Terpil Korkola story, Wilson, that's Edwin Wilson, Theodore Shackley, and Thomas Kleins. Those 5 people are terribly important, and they may begin to tell some other stories. If they're prosecuted or threatened, they'll reveal more. And their lifetime is the story of America from World War II to the present. They're very important people, and you'll be reading a lot of them for many years to come. In the meantime, we'll keep watching the news and see where they surface next, which countries, what they're doing. And I'll be back with you next week to update the Wilson Terpil stories for you.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.